Robert, thank you very much. Since your keynote has been very broad and I think tackled quite a bit of issues, I think this is not the time to start a discussion unless someone has a very urgent question. But I think you have stated some of the most important things that will run kind of through this conference, and I'm sure that people who have very urgent things to say can think it over tonight. And we will reconvene tomorrow at 9. Very urgent. Okay, just one, okay. But not another keynote.
No. I'm a subject of what you have stated, and I'm a Muslim, but I've been educated in philosophy by two Jews, Horkheimer and Adorno, and I learned to them to care about the language. And multiculturalism is based on cultural relativism, and you have described the outcome. And therefore, and this is my message, I propose in my work to replace the term of multiculturalism by the term of cultural relativism. To replace the term of multiculturalism by cultural pluralism, and the definition of pluralism, the application of political pluralism in a political system of democracy on cultures. So, I mean, we disagree, but there are core values that should never be violated. And this is the weak point of multiculturalism. There are no core values. Yeah? Like no anti-Semitism is a core value. Yeah? And this has to be honored. And this is not multiculturalism. It is cultural pluralism.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is helpful for the coming days. And on that happy note, thank you very much, and thank you again, Robert, for this broad lecture. See you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Wow. Echo. Welcome. This is the first session of this international conference. I'm just here to say a few words of greetings. I will be short, much briefer than last night at the opening. This is a session which will be chaired by Professor Bianca Kuhnel. I'll say a few words about her in a moment. As those of you who have come to previous events of the Vidal Sassoon Center are aware, we pride ourselves on taking a broad view of the question of anti-Semitism and placing it in a global context. And on this occasion, we're particularly proud and happy to welcome so many participants from countries all over the world, from the United States, from Australia, from France, from Germany, the United Kingdom, Eastern Europe, and of course, our Israeli colleagues, both from the Hebrew University and other universities. I would also like to point out, as you can see from the program, that we have a number of Austrian participants, which I think in the course of this morning you will understand both the historical setting and the value of having this input from Central Europe. It also gives me the opportunity to thank our most important partner in the organizing of this event. Although this is an event run by the Vidal Sassoon Center, it could not have happened without some help from our friends. And the most important of those friends was the European Forum at the Hebrew University, and Professor Bianca Kuhnel, who will chair this session, is the head of that forum. And I've had the pleasure of working with her for a number of years, an extremely professional, efficient, and very fine, thank you, and very fine organizer. And it really has been a very pleasant experience to work with her. I would say she also is in charge of the Austrian section. There is an Austrian Studies Center, which I helped to create a few years ago at the Hebrew University, and we are also very grateful to the Austrian Foreign Ministry for their help in bringing about this conference. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Bianca. Just one word about her own area of specialization. She is actually an art historian, and just a few moments ago we were discussing the colorful design that some of you may have noticed, symbolic of both of multiculturalism and, in some more abstract way, perhaps, of anti-Semitism. And as an art historian, Bianca expressed her appreciation of that design. But anyway, she is very familiar also with Central Europe, knows German very well, and I'm very glad that she'll be chairing this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. It came as a surprise to me. I wasn't prepared for a laudatio this early hour in the morning to myself, because I'm not really belonging here, unless you consider the medieval roots of European anti-Semitism, which we should probably do, but in another conference, not in this one. Well, my task as a chairperson has been made very easy by Robert, and I assume that he would also like to steer the discussion at the end of it, because his steering will probably, for sure, be more professional than mine. As I understand it, this session will be dedicated to the conceptual and the historical and the social roots of anti-Semitism, as a first session of such a kind of conference should be. And I'm very glad to introduce to you the first speaker, Professor Anton Pelinka. He's professor of political science at the University of Innsbruck, the dean of the School of Political Science and Sociology. Beginning with fall 2006, he will be professor of political science and nationalist studies at the Central European University in Budapest. Professor Pelinka is director of the Institute for Conflict Research in Vienna since 1990. And among his most recent publications, I have here The Haider Phenomenon in Austria, co-edited in 2002. Democracy, Indian Style, published in 2003. And he was also co-editor together with Günther Bischof of the series Contemporary Austrian Studies, which appears since 1993. Today he will speak about the concept and function of anti-Semitism.
I hope I can start this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give a rather general interpretation of anti-Semitism and of the most recent developments of this kind of hatred and prejudice. Yes. Thank you. So, yeah, thank you. So I will start with some introductory remarks. I am trying to analyze anti-Semitism from the viewpoint of an analyst. Of course, I am trying to analyze only those explanations which are not by definition anti-Semitic by themselves. One case of such an explanation I don't use is any kind of racist explanation. I also intend to put different variations of explanations into 4 chapters. Those periods are to a certain extent similar, of course, to other typologies we have been developed in the past. For instance, just one example, Manfred Gerstenfeld's distinction between religious, ethnic, and state-oriented anti-Semitism. If I try to put all those explanations into 4 periods, this does not mean that there is one explanation. Anti-Semitism has always to be seen as a mixture of different motives. The paper follows what I call a functional approach. It does not ask primarily about the reasoning behind and the explanation for anti-Semitism per se. It tries to look after the tasks, after the functions anti-Semitism had or still has to fulfill. Anti-Semitism is understood as an instrument that has been, is, and will be used by certain interests. Using such a functional approach, I do not explain anti-Semitism by focusing on the Jews, on Jewish history, or on a specific Jewish character. The focus is on anti-Semites and how they reasoned about Jews. My basic understanding is that anti-Semitism has nothing to do with Jews, but it has everything to do with anti-Semites. Now, obvious, the first period is the religious explanation. The Jew seen as an outsider in a uniform Christian society. The factual background is anti-Semitism was a product of a society defined by Christians within a homogeneous society designed by Christians for Christians. The so-called New Testament was used as a source of justifications for anti-Semitic rhetoric as well as anti-Jewish violence. The religious explanations are based on the early history of Christianity and the perception of Jews as Christ's murderers. Crusades, the Holy Inquisition, and other instruments were used to single out Jews as the internal enemy of a rather homogeneous society, as were Muslims as external enemies. Jews were offered 3 options: to convert, to emigrate, or to be killed. As the fate of especially Spanish Jews demonstrate, baptism was not always an opportunity to escape the other alternatives. Now, of some interest is Huntington's concept of clash of civilizations. His understanding of civilizations is, as you know, based on the understanding of the power and ability of religions to create civilizations. Significantly, he more or less includes Jews into the Western civilization, which is based on Catholic and Protestant dominance, transformed by a secular, more or less secular, understanding of society. Jews are, in that respect, more or less part of a Christian-dominated, secular Western civilization. Now, the period looking past we are speaking about is, of course, the period of pre-19th century Europe and the anti-Semitism using Christian justifications. The next period is a socio-economic explanation. The Jew seen as a prototype of capitalist and, on the other side, of revolutionary. The basic facts: anti-Semitism was used to interpret the bourgeois society. European Jewry, liberated by the bourgeois revolution, played a significant role in all aspects of social progress, beginning with the late 19th century. Now, the socio-economic explanation demonstrates the secularized version of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was instrumental for the political right, Jews as a core element of socialist revolution, and for the political left, Jews as the vanguards of capitalist exploitation. Nazism, but also some elements of Christian socialism, as can be seen, for instance, in the case of the Austrian Christian social movement, was able to combine both directions. The left, the anti-capitalist left, and the right, the anti-Marxist right version, combined. Jewish identity ceased to be defined by religion. Jews were defined by an invented race. The traditional left was not immune against anti-Semitism, as we know. Influenced by certain stereotypes, there was a tendency to see anti-Semitism just as a bourgeois maneuver to detract the anti-capitalist mood of the masses. I think an excellent example for that leftist approach is Bert Brecht's Die Rundköpfe und die Spitzköpfe, an example how blind the traditional left was with respect to anti-Semitism. Even after 1945, some parts of the communist as well as social democratic left considered anti-Semitism as a secondary phenomenon. When socialism will be established, Jews will disappear. There is an interesting statement of Karl Renner, at that time already president of the Second Republic of Austria of early 1946. He declared in an interview that there will be no place for Jews in a socialist Austria because capitalism has been overcome and socialism will solve the Jewish question by making Jews expendable. Now, the period was mostly the period of the 19th and first half of the 20th century. Now, the third period is a period strongly influenced by the experience of the Holocaust, the Jew as an invention of anti-Semites. Anti-Semitism played a specific role in explaining what could not be explained. The Jew responsible for natural disasters, responsible for the downfall of great powers, responsible for revolutionary movements, responsible for the decline of civilizations. I think still the most important person to be named in that respect is Jean-Paul Sartre. He represents the purest type of social psychological explanations, not only anti-Semitism, but the Jew himself. is the product of certain needs of anti-Semites. Adorno and his co-authors stand for the bridge between socio-economic and socio-psychological interpretations. Anti-Semitism is not determined by social differences, but social stratifications have a significant impact on anti-Semitism. This approach completely ignores Jews and concentrates on the socio-pathological needs of anti-Semites. Now, the understanding of anti-Semitism as the scapegoating of Jews is, as it is obvious in cases like Sartre and Adorno, not anti-Semitic. On the opposite, it is the probably best way to get a rather rational understanding of the anti-Semitic irrationalities. Nevertheless, this approach can be used for an indirect anti-Semitism. Cases of this kind of indirect anti-Semitism can be found by analyzing the attitude of some parts of the political left regarding the Holocaust. Especially, but not only, the communist left played down the specificities of the Jewish fate as it can be seen in the fight for victim status after 1945, when Jews became, in the communist narrative, just one part of the group of so-called communists and other patriots. This was the formula used by communist parties and communist systems. Now, when the Jew is only the result of a construction, a socio-pathological construction, a society beyond such a pathological status could be seen as a society without Jews. Sartre's consistent psychological approach can be misused for anti-Jewish aims to make the Jews disappear. When the when the society doesn't need Jews as scapegoats, there will be no Jews anymore left. The period we are talking about is the post-Holocaust period. The influence determining this understanding is the shock the Holocaust has created in at least the Western civilization. Now, the fourth and most recent period is a geopolitical explanation. The Jew is now the last colonialist, and of course, the state of Israel now comes into the picture. Beginning with and especially after the Nazi era, anti-Semitism ceased to be an almost exclusive European phenomenon. Anti-Semitism became global. Anti-Semitism provides those who oppose the existence of a Jewish state beyond the borders of Europe with an ideology. Anti-Semitism is not necessarily, but in many cases pragmatically, de facto linked not only to anti-Zionism but also to anti-Americanism, and I would like to add to a certain type of anti-Europeanism directed against a deeper European integration. The shift from intra-European to global perspectives during and after World War II started an export of anti-Semitism beyond Europe and beyond the sphere of Christian civilizations. In the Muslim world, anti-Semitism offered an explanation for the perceived role of permanent victimhood. The US dominance, especially after 1991, provoked a kind of global underdog anti-Americanism with sometimes open anti-Semitic elements. The old stereotype of the homeless Jew was transferred into the new stereotype of the Jew as the typical cosmopolitan. For instance, the rhetoric in the Slansky trial in Prague 1952, and as a natural enemy of indigenous cultures and civilizations. There is an unholy alliance consisting of old racist anti-Semites and new anti-imperialist forces, as represented, for instance, by the president of Iran, including also Holocaust denial. The European traditional anti-Semitism gets a reviving push from the progressive, so-called progressive dynamism in non-European countries or with respect to non-European countries. I think the decision of the British Universities Teachers Union, NATFAG, to exclude certain Israeli scholars from academic exchange is the most recent example of this kind of anti-Semitism. No Russian scholar is expected to renounce Russian war crimes. No Sudanese scholar is asked to speak out against his or her government. Only the scholars of the Jewish state are put to this ideological litmus test. Now, the period we are speaking about is, of course, the period after 1945, and especially after the end of the Cold War and after September 11 and the American War on Terror. Opposition against the existence of the State of Israel and against American dominance is sometimes, many times, accompanied by anti-Semitic rhetoric and deeds. Now let me come to a kind of perspective. Anti-Semitism is ever-changing its performance, its arguments, its perspectives, its overall reasoning. But it reflects a stratification of societies. The deeply rooted anti-Semitic stereotypes provide especially those afraid of present and future developments with a comfortable and simplistic theory. It explains their own failures, their own backlashes, their own defeats. Anti-Semitism permits easy answers to complex questions. This does not mean that anti-Semitism is a fixed, never-changing phenomenon. The shift of European anti-Semitism after 1945, and especially German and Austrian anti-Semitism, from a socially and culturally accepted and respected to a less accepted, not respected, and even unacceptable prejudice demonstrates the flexibility of an anti-Semitism who is able to go underground. This does not, of course, guarantee an end to anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism has changed the perceptions. Anti-Semitism is usually not open articulated as hatred of Jews, and this is one of the difficulties social research has to face in Europe. You cannot ask, do you hate Jews? You won't get a realistic answer. Anti-Semitism today is hidden behind anti-imperialist rhetoric, behind anti-Zionist protest, behind anti-globalization outrage, behind anti-war anger. But it still is detectable in its attitude to measure Jews and their behavior in a specific way others are not measured by. For instance, the killing of Arabs by Arabs is seen differently as the killing of Arabs by Jews. Capitalist, profit-oriented deeds are especially put on the shoulders of Jews. And war started by Americans, led by the so-called Jewish or Israel lobby, or by the East Coast, another code word, is seen differently as wars started by Africans, for instance, wars more or less overlooked by the peace-minded movements all over the world. There is a specific standard for Jewish behavior, and this is, of course, anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism has become a global phenomenon. It fulfills the function of the missing link between anti-globalization rhetoric from the right and the same rhetoric from the left. This is the universal return of an old pattern which identified Jews behind Wall Street and behind the Kremlin. Jews are seen responsible for universalism, defined either as global capitalism or, on the European continent, the key word is neoliberalism, or as enemies of any kind of indigenous identity. This creates a certain layer of an overall pattern. Today's anti-Semitism is linked to anti-Americanism, and at the same time both are linked to a peculiar anti-Europeanism directed against the concept of a deeper and more federalized European Union. The unholy alliance between traditional nationalism of the right and so-called anti-imperialism of the left is bound together by anti-Jewish, anti-American and anti-EU aggressiveness, as for instance articulated in the alliance which brought down the European Constitutional Treaty in France last year. The first victim of this alliance was the European Constitution. Now let me come to a kind of resume. Antisemitism has changed its shape. Antisemitism has become de-Europeanized, has become global. Antisemitism is not an attitude most of the anti-Semites, at least not in the Western civilization, openly claim to be proud of. Antisemitism has become, at least in Europe and in North America, a type of bashful anti-Semitism, but this does not change the phenomenon. Anti-Semitism still does exist, and now as a global phenomenon. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Pelinka. We move to our next speaker, and who will take us to Eastern Europe after World War I assume. Dr. Simcha Epstein is a senior researcher at the Vidal Sassoon International Center. He holds a PhD from the Political Science Department of the Sorbonne. His most recent book, Les Dreyfusards sous l'occupation, has been published in Paris in 2001 and has won a prize by the Académie Française. Dr. Epstein will speak today about the Jewish question in multinational states.
How Jews should organize themselves in an environment which is multicultural or multinational. What is the best system of organization? What is the best system of survival for Jews in such an environment? There are different historical models, and we are going to speak now of the model of national autonomy, national organization of the Jews, a model which started at the end of the 19th century and which developed after World War I during the interwar period. For that, you first need an acceptation by the Jews of the principle of being a national group and of being a national minority. It was not accepted by all the Jews in the Austrian Empire or in the Russian Empire. You had a part of the Jewish bourgeoisie who refused systematically the principle of a Jewish nation and of a Jewish national identity. And you had also the Zionists, which refused the principle of acting in the diaspora or acting in the Golan, in the lands of exile, which was a basic principle, a fundamental principle of Zionist ideology till the beginning of the 20th century. It's changed, this attitude of the Zionists changed dramatically in Austria with the Krakow Conference in 1905 or 1906, and for the Russian Zionists by the Helsingfors Conference in 1906, where they decided to start with what was called in those days a Gegenwartsarbeit, which means working for the present, not only waiting for the building of the country and waiting for the implementation, the final implementation of Zionism, but also working in the diaspora countries, meaning being active in the field of anti-Semitism, of Jewish culture, and also in the politics, what was called Galut politik, which means policy on the spot. That brought the Austrian Zionists and the Russian Zionists, the majority of them, not the totality of them, to adhere and to accept the principle of national autonomy for the Jews, which they refused before. You had also other groups who accepted the principle of national autonomy for the Jews, like the Volkspartei and other Jewish organizations. You had also the Bund, which progressively accepted the principle of cultural autonomy, not national autonomy, but cultural autonomy, which they accepted 1905, 1906. So you had a mass of the Jewish opinion and of the Jewish political parties who are ready to demand national autonomy. With difference, of course. For some of them, it was a basic demand. For the Zionists, it was a transitory demand, a provisional demand, till the final solution of the Jewish problem will be ready, till the state, which we know it will take time, it will take 20 years, 30 years, will be ready, we must ask for national autonomy. There were also tactical reasons which brought the majority of the leading parties in both empires, in both multinational empires, to the idea of demanding national autonomy for the Jews. The tactical reason is very well known. In the conflict between two nationalities, the Jews were asked to support the Poles, for instance, in Galicia, or to support the Hungarians in other places. And one of the solutions for the Jews was to say that we are supporting only the Jews. So we don't want to interfere in the fight between Poles and Germans or Hungarians and Slovaks and so on, all the different kind of ethnical conflicts in both empires. So the way supporting the idea of Jewish national autonomy was a way of escaping the national conflicts of both empires. This was a tactical, of course, argument. There were also more fundamental arguments, which were, we are a nation, so we have to demand, we have to present ourselves as a nation. And then started the question of what should we ask, which kind of autonomy. Of course, we cannot ask for a territorial autonomy, and so we must ask for a personal autonomy, which is an autonomy which is not linked directly to the fact we are living here and there. And we have to build, not only to ask for the Jews, we have to build a general system, a general model of autonomy which should be good also for other minorities. And in particular, remember the map of the Austrian Empire and the map of the Russian Empire, minorities in minorities. You have towns and cities with a lot of minorities in the same cities. You have minorities living in minorities. So even if you give territorial autonomy to nations, even if you go to a territorial solution, you will remain still with the problem of minorities. This will happen after First World War, of course, when we will see that every new national state which will be built on the ruins of the Austrian Empire, of course, will be a state with a majority, of course, a national majority, and a lot of national minorities, including, of course, the Jews. So the system that was elaborated by the Jews, and there were different systems, I will present only one of those systems, The system that was elaborated was by the Jews was, of course, a system of personal autonomy and not of territorial autonomy. I choose to present you the system which was, according to me, the maximalistic system and the most elaborated system. It was presented by Shlomo Kaplansky. Shlomo Kaplansky was the head of the World Union of Labor Zionists, Poalei Zion. It was presented in 1917 to the Socialist International, to the neutral meeting of the Socialist International, which was convened by the Sweden and the Hollandish in Stockholm. It was a very important meeting because it was the first meeting of the Socialist International fighting for peace and preparing the new world for after war. And Shlomo Kaplansky led a Jewish campaign. It was a successful campaign because all the demands of of the Poalei Zion were accepted by the Stockholm Conference and by the other conferences that were to come in Amsterdam, Bern, and other. The system presented by Shlomo Kaplansky was a system which was good both for general minorities and for solving in general the problem of national minorities, and it was good too for the Jews. It was both a general system and a specific system solving the Jewish question. A few features of the system presented by Kaplansky and accepted by the socialist meeting of Stockholm. Basically accepted, not in its totality, but in its main line. It's a comprehensive system, an integrative system, based on personal autonomy. You adhere to your nation, and your adhesion to the nation is not linked to the place you live in. Secondly, affiliation is compulsory. Affiliation is not on a voluntary base. Once you are qualified as belonging to that nation or to the other nation, you belong to it. It's very difficult to extract yourself from the nation you belong to. The nation is organized on the basis of elections, local elections and national elections, and the nation is represented by a national council, of course, which belongs to the state, which is a multinational state with a majority nation and minority nations. Each nation or each national system has very broad prerogatives. Not only cultural prerogatives, which is obvious, of course, schools and teaching prerogatives, which is obvious, schools being financed by the state, of course, normally financed by the state, but they have also other prerogatives, like social prerogatives, political prerogatives, prerogatives in terms of economy, prerogatives in terms of the judicial system, and so on. It's really a state in a state, not in a base of in a territorial base, but in a personal base. Kaplansky adds, Kaplansky adds different points which are specific to the Jews and not for the others. The Jewish nation so organized, of course, the different national Jewish councils in the different countries will be linked into an international world organization representing the totality of the Jewish people. This totality of the Jewish people will be also in charge with all the problem of immigration and emigration of the Jews, and they will be also in charge, adds Kaplansky, for the building of Palestine. Palestine is introduced in the system by Kaplansky in order to show that our final aim, our final goal is Palestine, of course, and what I'm proposing now is for the 30, 20, 40 years to come. That's the system in its totality. Of course, it's an extremist and maximalist system. It will not be accepted by the Peace Conference, of course. The Peace Conference, not of the Socialist International, but the Peace Conference, which also has to discuss in 1919, 1920, also has to discuss a lot of programs of solving the Jewish question in the peace treaties. And we all know, it's better known than the Kaplansky affair and than the Poalei Zion affair, we all know the work of the Jewish diplomacy, which means all the Jewish organizations are organized in the Peace Conference in Paris, are organized in a Committee of the Jewish Delegation, Comité de Délégation Juive, the secretary, the general secretary of which is Leo Motzkin, We all know the ideological debate at the beginning of the work of this committee. There is a difference between the representatives of France and Britain who are still faithful to the old system of Jewish identity, meaning if you are a Jew in a country, you belong to the nation, citizenship and nationality are the same. There is no minority, there is no Jewish national minorities, there is no Jewish national identity in France or in England. Opposing to them, of course, the representative of Eastern Europe, also the representative of the United States. The United States, the American Jewish Congress, support the national demands against the French and the British. At the end, as we know, there is a compromise, and the compromise is to accept the principle of minority rights. And basically, there is a fight. The Jews are very well represented in the peace conferences. The Jews are consulted by the allies when they dictate or when they decide the fate of all the new nations which are born in these treaties. And we know the results, of course. We know the peace treaties who accept the minority rights, not as much as Kaplansky would have liked as he presented to the Socialist International, of course, but some minority rights. The terms are, in general terms, not mentioning the Jews, apart from some specific point where you have to mention the Jews. For instance, the classical paragraph 11 of the treaty with Poland, where the Shabbat is mentioned, because you have to ask a specific Jewish demand for the respect of the Shabbat, the possibility for the Jews not to work on the Shabbat, so that you have to write it in specific terms and not in general terms, of course. But basically, the idea is to introduce freedom for all minorities and rights for all minorities. There is a success, a Jewish diplomatic success after the First World War, a wonderful, a tremendous success. Of course, it will be completely forgotten in our collective conscience for obvious reasons because of what will happen afterwards. So it will completely disappear from our perception. But it was a tremendous diplomatic success. Of course, reality and facts were different. Every new country accepted formally the principle of respecting the minorities. Practically, it was very difficult for the majority to accept and to respect the rights of the minorities. First, the rights were reduced only to the rights of speaking your own language. Secondly, teaching was not financed. Teaching other languages and the dominating language in the majority of the countries, apart from Latvia and Lithuania and some other countries, but in Poland, for instance, the school did not accept the financing of schools who were teaching in other languages than in Polish. And so, compared to what was written in the peace treaties, of course, there was a dramatic reduction of prerogatives and of rights of the minority. And so the Jews, and particularly the Jews of Poland, had a strategic dilemma which characterized the 20s and a little less the 30s, but essentially the 20s, at a period when anti-Semitism was existing, but was still at a low level or at level of middle intensity. The Jews had a strategic dilemma. Shall we organize ourselves as a minority fighting against the Poles? Which means, shall we organize ourselves as a minority and unite with other minorities? In Poland, there were two other minorities, important minorities, of course, the Germans on the west and the Ukrainians or Ruthenes in the east. So shall we make a block of minorities and fight together against the Poles? The Poles meaning the leading or the majority of the Poles as a nationality, not as a citizenship, of course. Everyone is Polish. You understand? As far as nationality is concerned. This was a decision, this was a strategy proposed and organized by Yitzhak Greenbaum, and it succeeded. It succeeded for one time. It succeeded in 1922, in the elections of 1922, by a common electoral bloc between the Germans, the Ukrainians, and the Jews. The Jews succeeded, and they were the main the main for technical and mechanical reasons linked to the electoral law of those days. Jews were the main were those who for whom the bloc the minority blocs gave the best results in the Sejm and in the Senate. More or less, the Jews received a representation. The Jewish parties, Jewish national parties, received a representation in the Sejm and in the Polish Senate, more or less proportional to their population, to the part of the population. There were 10% of the general Polish population. They received more or less a representation of 10%. 10% mean general Zionist, Zionist Socialist, Agudat Israel, all the parties we know, because they are still the parties of Israeli political life, of course, were represented and did represent in the Polish parliament the Jewish population. This was a success, and it was the end of the success, because it appeared very quickly that this policy does not solve the basic problem of the Jewish population, and then start new dilemmas in Polish Jewish strategy. Shall we continue our oppositional minority to the center, or shall we ally ourselves with the center? And a lot of groups in the Jewish political life in Poland preferred. I'm not speaking only of Agudat Israel. It was true also for a part of the Zionists. A part of the general Zionists, they said it's completely useless to confront the Poles. We have to unite ourselves with the Poles, not to become Poles as a nationality. Of course, we remain a Jewish minority, but our alliance has to be with the majority and not an alliance with the two minorities. That was a debate in the 20s. The debate, of course, lost all its relevancy afterwards with the rise of anti-Semitism, particularly by the Germans and also by the Poles, and it changed completely the context in which the debate was appeared in the 20s. And that brings me to my main conclusion. National autonomy, or the Jews being a national minority with a lot of prerogatives or without prerogatives, with a lot of prerogatives as they would have liked to, or without prerogatives as it was in fact, was completely neutral as far as anti-Semitism is concerned. It was not an antidote to anti-Semitism, it was not a protection against anti-Semitism, and it was not a factor of anti-Semitism, it was not an accelerator of anti-Semitism. It had no effect on anti-Semitism, not in that direction and not in the other direction. That's the most important thing to understand from the Jewish experience from the 20s and the 30s. What the Jews decide to be, or what the Jews decide to do, being a nation organized, or being members of the dominating nation, being organized as a national opposition, or searching to be integrated or to be linked to the majority, had no influence on anti-Semitism. For obvious reasons. Anti-Semitism had other reasons, had other factors which were not linked to the fact that the Jews were national Jews or were assimilated Jews. And I will give a few examples which are very logical. In Poland, in the same days, the Jews, which represented 10% of the population, of the total populations, represented 50% of trade activities and commercial and trade activities, according to Jewish numbers, to Jewish statistics, not to anti-Semitic statistics. So this had nothing to do with the fact that the Jewish traders were members of the Polish nation, of the Jewish bourgeoisie, members of the Polish nation, such a minority, or to the fact that the Jews, these same Jewish traders, were proud members of the Jewish nationality. It has nothing to do. the basic fact which confronted the Polish majority to the Jews, to the Jewish minority, was the fact that a minority of 10% controlled 50% of the trade. This was a basic social fact, which was one of the generators of anti-Semitism in Poland. The same is true for religious anti-Semitism, which of course has nothing to do with the fact that the Jews are Polish or the Jews are Jews or national Jews, of course, nothing to do. Political anti-Semitism had nothing to do with that kind. So all the different kinds, or all the different dimensions of anti-Semitism, which Professor Pelinka mentioned in his presentation, of course, had nothing to do with the fact that the Jews present himself, I'm a Pole of Jewish persuasion or of Jewish faith, or I'm a proud national Jew. It had nothing to do. Nothing to do. It was important for the Jewish inner debate. It was important for the Jewish inner fight between different ideologies of the future of the Jews, of the nature of the Jews, of the destiny of the Jews. It was important, but it has no effect on the report, on the relations between the Jews and the non-Jews. It didn't change anything in the fact that anti-Semitism started to grow in the 30s, of course, by the German minority. It's obvious, but also by the Polish majority. Anti-Semitism came from other things. Anti-Semitism is not linked to the way the Jews present themselves or define themselves. And this is relative, and this is my conclusion. It's also relative to today. Of course, in different terms. We're not speaking of national minorities, but we're speaking of communities. How should a Jewish community organize itself in a world, in a Europe of multicultural and multi-ethnic groups and of state? And my conclusion for what I said about the 20s, but I have other arguments, of course, if there will be a discussion during our conference, of course, we will speak about it, is that it is not linked, the fate of the Jews is not linked to the way they present themselves. The inner fate is certainly linked to the way they present themselves, of course. But the external fate, the relation between Jews and non-Jews, is not linked to the fact that the Jews are national, assimilated, religious, non-religious, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Epstein. I think that one of the reasons that I have been invited to chair this session was because I'm able to correctly pronounce the name and the place of birth of our next speaker. Leon Volovich was born in Iași, Romania, of course. He is also a senior researcher at the Vidal Sassoon International Center. He has all my admiration because he continued to research and publish important things about the history of the Romanian Jewry, which deserve to be researched and published. Among his many publications, a book published by the Oxford Pergamon Press, National Ideology and Antisemitism, the Case of Romanian Intellectuals in the 30s. I was surprised to see in his curriculum that he has published the journal, the diaries of Michael Sebastian, one of the best, to my eyes, writers of the European writers, I should say. And he also produced the Hebrew edition of these diaries in 2003. He is also the author of Antisemitism in Post-Communist Eastern Europe, and of many, many other studies about Eastern European Jewish, not only Romanian, and he will speak today about the East European Jews between cultural autonomy and ethnic identity.
I change a bit the title. I'll dealing not only with Jewish ethnic identity, but also with anti-Semitism. I understand that I cannot cope without anti-Semitism. I think continuing Simcha's survey on Eastern Europe, which is now the new Europe, or better, Alt-Neue Europe, I think it's worth comparing the post-World War situation with that after the fall of the communist regimes. In both historical crossroads, despite the great differences, we can find a dramatic change of political borders, followed by a difficult process of redefining national identities, a revision of the political agenda, and the molding of a national policy adapted to the new configuration of the country and dominant European trends. From the perspective of Jewish history, the differences are radical. The Holocaust and massive immigration have meant that the recent changes have a less dramatic impact on the situation of the Jews who remain in this part of Europe. It could be said that a common trait remains, anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism has also undergone a spectacular metamorphosis. World War I and the peace treaties signed and its aftermath led not only to adjusting the borders of Europe, of the new states, out of crumbling empires, but also to a radical shift in the structure of the Jewish communities in Central and Eastern Europe. As a result of these changes, the Jews, included overnight in the newly redrawn boundaries of the states, found themselves in an unprecedented situation. In some cases, as in Transylvania, Bukovina, or Bessarabia, the Jewish communities unwillingly changed their national status and were now numerically greater than the pre-war Jewish community. They were also totally distinct from them in terms of history, ties to Jewish tradition, internal organization, social composition, and the civil and economic status of their members. The Bolshevik Revolution and the Civil War in Russia had an immediate effect on the area. At the same time, two processes were taking place in Russia: the impressive rise of several Jewish leaders to top position in Bolshevik Russia, on one hand, and the rapid collapse of Jewish religious and cultural autonomy on the other. Noteworthy in this context is the brief and dramatic episode of the Hungarian Revolution, led by Bela Kun. In a coincidence that carried symbolic significance, and that it underscored the two options facing the Jews at the time, the Balfour Declaration concerning the right of the Jewish people to establish a national home in Palestine was issued in the same months as the Bolshevik Revolution occurred. Historians who sought to understand the social state of mind in the newly emerged states were puzzled by the strikingly tense atmosphere and the widespread feeling of frustration. Even among the nations who had been in the war on the winner side and whose territorial demands had been satisfied, soon realized that the fruits of success had to be equally shared with the ethnic minorities, who represented as much as a third of the population in some countries. In the defeated countries that had suffered great territorial losses, there was a sense of national catastrophe, and the frustration were directed to the most internal and internally guilty at hand. Thousands of Jews who had been mobilized during the war were sentenced for alleged treason and spying in trials accompanied by fiercely anti-Semitic campaigns. The press and the political leaders fostered an atmosphere of imminent Bolshevik invasion. With the exception of Czechoslovakia, the project of redefining national and at the same time a multi-ethnic states in this part of Europe soon appeared to fail. In this regard, I will mention the profound analysis made by the Hungarian philosopher István Bibo, which attempted at the end of the Second War to explain the causes of this new failure and the distress of the small East and Central European countries. Significant to our discussion is Bibo's severe critique of the anti-democratic nationalist model prevailing in this region. The communitarian political hysteria, it's his expression, provoked by the fear of losing independence and the recently annexed territories. The hypertrophy of the national consciousness, an unrealistic and disproportionate reaction to external influences and pressures, and especially the tendency to divert responsibility for any failure onto a community from beyond the nations defined in strictly ethnic and racial terms. The national policy in these countries was based on a so-called organic relation between nationalism, anti-democracy, and antisemitism, an assumption which everywhere undermined the real process of integrating the Jewish population. In some countries, civil emancipation was in fact imposed from outside through the Minorities Treaty, an imposition that strengthened xenophobic hostility. During the 1930s, most of the Central and East European Jewish communities were swept with an unprecedented surge of violence and antisemitism, accompanied by stepped-up anti-Jewish propaganda in the press. What took place rocked all levels of Jewish society, primarily the political and spiritual leaders. The rights of the Jews were called into doubt. Their role in the war was negated. Demonstrations and acts of violence by students demanding numerus clausus for the Jews and propaganda campaigns in the press fueled anti-Semitic throughout Romania, Hungary, and Poland. How did the Jewish leaders, the intellectuals, respond to these events? The heads of the main Jewish organization were now forced to establish a new order of priorities. First and foremost were the defense of Jewish civil rights and the struggle against the rising tide of antisemitism. These factors shaped the attitude of the political leaders and the Jewish intellectual elite in both the practical sphere and the realm of public debate. Their relationship to the Jewish community and the community's objective, their definition of Jewish identity, and in general, their integration within the political reality of each country. The complex nature of the Jewish communities, from Orthodox Jews, many of them living in traditional shtetl, to secular Jews on the brink of full or partial assimilation into German, Polish, Hungarian, Czech, or Romanian culture, obviously affected the perception of the Jewish leaders and intellectuals as to the community's character, the necessary courses of action, and the options for Jewish political involvement. In the countries of Central and Eastern European that became nation states with the collapse of the Habsburg Empire and the fall of the Tsar, nationalist leanings had a direct effect on the orientation and political behavior of the Jewish communities. During the 30s and 30s, their Jewish national identity intensified along with the emergence of a more clearly defined position on Zionism. Two key factors contributed to this process: the influence of the Jewish communities from the newly annexed territories and the wave of antisemitism. From an ideological standpoint, there is a clear-cut distinction between the national politics of some communities and organizations, such as in Bessarabia or Bukovina, and the major central Jewish organizations within the old borders, which advocated a unique form of assimilation. On the one hand, it preserved Jewish identity and awareness of ethnic Jewish affiliation, and on the other, it supported integration into social and political life of the country while adopting secular values. This approach was particularly attractive to the Jewish bourgeoisie and middle class. On the opposing side stood the Jewish nationalist and Zionist organization, who were appalled by those who supported the assimilationist trend. The goal of these trends was to reinforce the national and religious component, the status of ethnic and national minorities, and to strive to obtain cultural autonomy. With respect to internal Jewish life, the emphasis was placed on fostering Jewish values and promoting a Zionism that was primarily cultural in nature. A different, mainly liberal secular spirit reigned in the intellectual circles of Central European Jewry. They longed to be proud, loyal citizens, to integrate into the country's social, political, and cultural life, where they hoped to distinguish themselves and to play a role in strengthening a democratic society that would ensure, or so they thought, the preservation of their achievement. The leaders of this mainstream trend were certain of the power of law and considered their loyalty and devotion to country to be beyond dispute. In nearly all these countries, the modern Jewish national aspirations and programs were obviously in conflict with similar national developments within the majority population. Frequently, the sudden success of a certain political or ideological Jewish movement was mostly a consequence or a response to the rise of a radical political movement with a bold anti-Semitic message. The difficulties of homogenizing the redefined nation and tensions with other minorities were simultaneous with an antagonistic relation to the Jewish communities. It was a fatal synchronization, sometimes a dangerous competition for a symbolic national redemption, reminding the well-known prayer of the Maggid of Kozhenitze, Lord of the world, know that the children of Israel suffered too much. They deserve redemption. They need it. If, however, you do not yet want to grant this for reasons that are known to me, then at least redeem the other nations, but quickly. In a period of exacerbated nationalism, when the idea of Europe was losing the previous significance, the modern Jewish intellectuals were extremely proud to be European, an identification which nobody took seriously except the Jews themselves. Their answer to nationalism was a symbolic construct of a Europe as a unique cultural space of culture, reason, and science, an imaginary fatherland in which they would feel at home. After the collapse of the communist regimes, the ethnic conflict and prejudices hidden or pushed aside during the half-century-long communist interlude once more arose to the surface with the well-known consequences. However, unlike the post-World War period, the prevailing trend is totally different. The political agenda in this area are two transnational, liberal, and democratic. The new key concepts are now European integration and globalization. Nationalism, xenophobia, and ethnocentric isolation are withdrawn to the fringes of political spectrum and the radical right-wing press. Even conservative parties, while in power, as in Poland and present, accept the new trend. But the absence of democratic traditions leads usually to reject and condemn communism by using instead an amorphous ideology close to the extreme right, legitimizing the idea that only the far right is the only true opposition to communism. In the former communist countries, globalization means merely to enter Europe and to be under the military and economic protection of the United States. These two options are not necessarily convergent, and became sources of tension. Poland and Romania's pro-American position provoke West European irritation. There is a widespread belief that the marvelous key to open the gates of Europe and America is to be politically correct, to preach liberalism, and to enact severe laws against anti-Semitism and racial prejudice, not necessarily to apply them, and to risk losing popularity among strongly nationalist groups. In this case, you can appeal to another key American phrase, the right to free speech. On the other side, many intellectuals have developed a real allergy to the concept of political correctness, perceived as a new ideological conformism similar to the communist one that imposes a certain social behavior, and to refuse to accept it could be punished by public reprimand. It immediately awakens in the memory of those from former communist countries the idea of conformism associated with coercion and duplicity, to think one thing and to say something else, imposed by an authority identified previously with the communist regime and identified now with pressure from abroad, the West, the United States, European community, the Jewish lobby. The attitude toward Jews frequently enters into these patterns of simulated Europeanization, but also within the opposite nationalist discourse. The hostile anti-Israeli attitude is far less intense and obsessive than in some Western countries. Even in the anti-Semitic discourse, it is not the Israeli-Arab issue at stake, but the myth of Israel at the center of a world conspiracy. It's not difficult to notice in all the post-communist countries a very paradoxical contrast between the intensity and frequency of anti-Semitic attacks in the extremist press and, by difference, the good situation of the remaining Jewish communities, greater or smaller, as well as the friendly atmosphere surrounding any official Israeli representative. Anti-Semitic prejudices are now rather of a spiritual, imaginary level, of a mythical Jew unconnected to the real Jews from the small local communities. That explains the quick link of the spiritualized anti-Semitism with the anti-globalization slogans, presenting globalization as a new embodiment of Jewish plans of conquering the world. Israel is a key element of the present anti-Semitic mythology, especially as a superpower dominating world policy. The leader of the Great Romanian Party, for example, wrote in his newspaper, "America doesn't accept any initiative without her consent. It doesn't matter whether one country or another can be attacked and destroyed, as Yugoslavia or Iraq. What is important is that the world must fear America, and America fears Israel. This is beyond any doubt." To the ambiguous acceptance of democracy belongs another phenomenon significant, especially in the political life of post-communist countries: the lack of a clear distinction between the democratic groups and the extremist ones. Extremist politicians and publicists can be seen as an honorable presence in the democratic press. Respectable politicians accept interviews and collaborate with extremist journals. It's a fluidity, a lack of borders, which facilitates the legitimation of French politicians and authors, producing a misleading impression that all of them, extremists and Democrats, are valid participants in the democratic and, of course, pluralistic public life. The success or the failure of the contemporary ideologies such as communism, but also the collapse of communism, globalism and multiculturalism, and even the Vatican's steps toward the reconciliation with Judaism, all are symptoms of the invisible hand of the great Jewish manipulators in conformity with the protocols of the elders of Zion. In countries dominated by a strong ethnocentric tradition, the idea of multiculturalism is hard to accept and seemed rather a new attempt to undermine national sovereignty. This process of alignment with Western European tendencies includes also the obligation to revisit the dark chapters of the participation of some Eastern European governments and population in the Nazi final solution. Here, I would say, the main core of anti-Semitic popular reaction. Finally, it's important to remark that in the East European countries, we find also free Jewish community life, a growing interest in Jewish culture, along with the creation of cultural and academic institutions studying Judaism. In the past few years, we also see a very visible reaction in public opinion against anti-Semitism. Many public debates in the mass media on sensitive topics connected to the Holocaust, racism, and anti-Semitic prejudice. Especially in the last 10 years, there is a real discovery of the cultural values of the vanished Jewish communities and the rebuilding of a Jewish space, a mixture of a new fashion and true interest in Jewish topics reveals a normal or sympathetic perception of the Jewish world and Central Eastern Europe. This process is widespread among the younger generation, and it could be seen as a mark of Europeanization. It's also a belated echo of the earlier veneration of Europe by the emancipated Jews. There is also a parallel effort by many young Jews to openly assume their identity, to practice Jewish habits or the religious way of life, sometimes as an expression of disagreement with their parents' alienation from their own Jewish identity. Therefore, it's not without irony that globalization and Europeanization has allowed a free assumption of Jewish identity and a too late, rediscovery of the Jewish heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Volovich. We are almost at the end of the coffee break, but we'll nevertheless allow a few questions, I think. Yes? Okay. Please do.
Stand up?
Yes, and speak to the microphone.
I have a question for Professor Pelinka concerning his conclusion. In the conclusion, you seem to suggest that the best explanation for today's anti-Semitism is psychological. And you also mentioned the boycott of British lecturers. Would you explain their behavior on the grounds of psychology, that is to say, what you refer to as the attempt to overcome their own defects and their own defeats? This is
Just a very brief comment on Dr. Volovich's excellent presentation. I was struck by your reference to demands for numerus clausus on the Jews in these Eastern European countries, because there were quite similar demands in Austria at the same period. And it led me to think about the possibility of including Austria in such comparative analysis, since after all, this is also a new nation of a sort that's been created in the result of World War I, and one which has minorities in it.
Thank you. Richard?
I think a question or disagreement with Professor Pelinka. You mentioned as an illustration of a strain of anti-Semitism, the vote against the EU in France. Now, my reading of that was that, in fact, it was a vote against the EU because, not necessarily explicitly, there was a sense that the EU was pursuing policies which included policies that I think we could associate with anti-Semitism, including what Bati Oras described as Eurabia. That was, in fact, one of the elements that made them so uneasy about giving a blank check to the European Union. So I mean, I was in France at the time. I don't remember that anti-EU forces using anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic arguments. Maybe you can correct me.
One more, and then we'll stop questioning. Oh, okay.
Oh, please.
Oh,
Please.
well,
I guess it's directed more to Epstein. When you spoke about the fact that the internal organization or attitude of the Jewish community did not affect the anti-Semitism, I wonder if it sort of made me think of certain anti-Semites, both in the Soviet time and at the present, where there was a distinction. I mean, maybe it was artificial, but for example, in the Soviet time, Gennady Shimanov, where those who wanted to go to Israel were regarded good, like goodbye, and that will solve our Jewish problem. And in the present time, you have people like Dugin. It's sort of artificial, but there is a distinction between the bad Jews, the kind of globalists, as opposed to the ones who are nationalists in their Jewish way. And so, as if one were that kind of Jew, you could accept it, and if you were the other kind, then that's bad.
Professor Gilman and Professor Kibi, and this would be I'm sorry.
First of all, I wanted to thank all three panelists. I thought they were excellent papers and they went well together. I'm a little bit ill at ease by Shimon Epstein's split, which echoed Pelinka's views, that somehow or another there are two independent universes. One here on Earth, which is where the anti-Semites live, and then Mars, where the Jews live. It is very clear that all conceptual structures are shared by communities that live in common spaces and common times. How they process these may be different, but that they are interwoven, and that the Jews respond to images existing in the general culture about Jews, whatever that word means, and that non-Jews understand themselves oftentimes both in terms of their understanding of Jewish perceptions of non-Jews, but also of the function of Jews in the world. These aren't separate categories. And it's not that one looks for the so-called kernel of truth. I don't believe in kernels of truth. That is, a Jewish character, or, as Professor Pelinka said at the beginning, the new sociobiological arguments for anti-Semitism. But that rather one has to understand that these are interactive constructions that have to be understood as interactive, or else you lose the point. That is, the notion of an anti-Semitism without Jews turns out to be, of course, specious. The famous context for that statement, of course, was Poland in the post-war period. And surprise, surprise, after '89, lots of Jews came out of the closet. It was an anti-Semitism with Jews. So I'm very anxious about that split, because what it does is to privilege the anti-Semites on the one hand, and to view the Jews as existing in a separate plane on the other.
Incidentally, my question is related. The plight and the existence of the Jews in Europe is becoming, for good or for worse, a paradigm for Muslims now living in Europe. And this is a deliberation in question to all three of you. Yeah? I start with Simon Epstein. I completed my PhD thesis in Epsteiner Straße in Frankfurt. Yeah? So I'm sorry. I mean, two models were addressed from all three presentations, but the model is, Jews with national autonomy. I call this communitarism, and the other model is assimilation. Yeah? And I share with all of three of you the rejection of both extremes. But there's something in between, and I call it integration. I was consulting the French government in the 90s when they abandoned the concept of assimilation, and I recommended to them the concept of integration, intégration, and it is limited only to civic values. Yeah? And as a Muslim immigrant in Europe, I reject communitarism because it leads really to the balkanization of the polity. So, and there must be something to share, and you can keep your distinctiveness and share something with the others. And what do you think about the middle way of integration? To be a member of a polity and to be, to maintain your identity, but without a segregation. So integration is limited to sharing civic values, and we are all similar. We have a commonality despite the distinctiveness.
Thank you very much. Professor Pelinka, would you start?
Okay, well, thank you. First, according to Jean-Paul Sartre, and I still think he provides us with an excellent approach to the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism indicates a certain need on the side of the anti-Semites. And to explain own defeats is just one aspect of those needs. In the Middle Ages, of course, it was a phenomenon to explain what could not be explained, and the Jews as a scapegoats provided a kind of explanation. Now, with respect to explaining own defeats, I had in mind especially this type of Islamic anti-Semitism, the love to be defeated, the love to be a permanent victim, the battle who is the victim. Battle for victimhood. Who is more victims, the Jews or the Muslims? The love of being underdog. This is one aspect which explains some sides of anti-Semitism. Now, with respect to the British Higher Education Teachers Union, I don't know enough about it. I don't know enough about the structure and stratification of the members of this particular union. But to single out the status of the Jews, of course, it's legitimate to criticize whatever kind of Israeli policy you want to criticize, but not to talk about human rights violation in Russia, in Sudan, in the Congo, wherever, and to say you are only entitled to invite the Russian scholar. He distinguished himself or herself from Russian policy. Now, this singling out of the Jewish state, this, I think, must be called anti-Semitic, because it's a Jewish state, and not the Russian state, and not the Sudanese state, and not whatever, Pakistan. Oh, sorry. It doesn't work. Okay, sorry. Have I to repeat what I said before? Okay. Now, with respect to this EU referendum, this is, I think, a project I would like to do in the future to understand better this alliance of right-wingers and left-wingers bringing down the European Constitutional Treaty in France. It was clearly an alliance of Le Pen's Front National and some parts of the Socialist Party plus the Communist Party. Now, this alliance, of course, cannot be simply called anti-Semitic. This would be a gross oversimplification. But as Robert Wistrich has pointed out last night in his keynote address, Austro-Hungary was called also by Lamash the United States of Greater Austria. Now, if we think of a deepening of the European Union as a step towards establishing the United States of Europe, you have two opponents against this. First, those who insist on a specific ethnic or national identity and not wanting to mix this specific kind of identity with a supranational identity. And secondly, those who misunderstand the deepening of the European Union as defining Europe as a, quote, neoliberal, unquote, system, which I think it's a complete misunderstanding. Now, what the case of the Habsburg Empire and the concept of the United States of Europe, by the way, as far as I know, the first one who used this term was Winston Churchill, but it did not include the UK into the United States of Europe. It was a continental Europe concept. The Jews can be seen, and this term cosmopolitan, so many times used as a code word for Jews, the Jews are seen, for good or bad reasons, as supranational pillars, pillars of supranationality, like in the latest period of the Habsburg Empire. And again, in the near future, I would like to do research. What are the motives of the nationalists like the Front National in France, and of those leftists who sided indirectly with the French nationalists to bring down a constitution which was a step towards a United States of Europe concept. This is, in that respect, only an intention I have in mind, so I have just to give you a kind of hypothesis. To Bassam Tibi, just one remark about the integration because it was directed to all three of us. Yes, I think integration under the precondition of a kind of secular state, the understanding that the state is not Christian, not Muslim, not Jewish, not Buddhist, not Hinduist. Then, of course, integration is the reasonable, basic concept you can have. Yeah, okay, yes. Yes, I think this is for Muslims an interesting and I think the only feasible concept. I just would doubt one aspect of the parallelity between Jews and Muslims. At the end, you have a Muslim identity due to your own decision. You can be a Muslim and you can stop to be a Muslim. You cannot stop to be a Jew in an anti-Semitic environment. Baptism does not save you from being a Jew. This is the lesson we have learned beginning with the 19th century. This is one difference, but I think many aspects can be seen as a parallel.
Thank you very much.
Stephanie, yes, you're right that good Jews are Jews who leave the country. But let us remember, if a Jew say he's a Russian and he wants to be a member of the Russian nation, they may say he infiltrates into the nation. If the Jew says he is a Jew and a proud Jew, they may say he separates from the nation. And so there is always an answer to any kind of behavior of national or psychological Jewish behavior. I mean, if he is religious, they say, oh, he's different from it. If he's not religious, they have another way of planning it. We know all that. We know the multiplicity of the anti-Jewish arguments, and it's very easy to answer to all of that. The illusion of certain Jews is to think that if they choose a certain direction, it will be good for the anti-Semites because they will have nothing to answer to them or nothing to say. It's an illusion, we know that. And it's very easy to deal with that kind of attitude. Professor Gilman, I sincerely think there is a split, and a real split, and a historical split. Not a day-to-day split, because you see them in Warsaw working together, speaking together, and suddenly history makes a difference. And suddenly the two realities which were intermingled and which acted together and which spoke more or less the same language, and suddenly you have two fates, you have two histories, and you have something completely different. There is, and this is one of what we saw in Jewish history in the 20th century, there is a split. And so I really think, but it's a debate, of course, we have to speak about that. I really think that there is no influence when anti-Semitism, it's is in a low level or a bearable level, I agree with you. The solutions which are good for the Jews may be also good for the non-Jews and reciprocally. But when anti-Semitism starts to rise above a certain level, let us say, it becomes completely different. And then the Jewish question becomes different from any other national or any other minority question. This is my answer to Professor Tibi. There is a degree where the Jews are like the other. And the same problems and the same problematics are good for the Jews. For instance, as you say, integration and not assimilation, or integration and not separation, for instance, is good for the Jews. Above a certain level of anti-Semitism, the Jewish question is different from any other question. We are speaking of things completely different. The fate of the Jews is different from the fate of the majority and from the fate of other minorities.
Thank you very much.
Only a short remark. Concerning your question about the numerus clausus in Austria and the connection with Eastern Europe, I will answer with only one detail. In Romania, for example, the student movement for numerus clausus started in 22 at the Cluj University. Cluj is Transylvania. Transylvania was part till the First World War of the Austrian Empire. So it's of course it's a great connection, because mentality and political behavior is not connected to the changes of borders. And from this point of view, you are right, it must be seen in connection with Austria, not only on Romania, but also in Poland and in Czechoslovakia and all this. No, I don't. I finished with the numerous clauses. I'm talking generally about political behavior. It's connected to the farmer mentality and political, but if it's, however, justified not to include Austria in this discussion, because in these new countries, all the efforts, from the Jewish part and also from the majority population, it's to try to build a new national policy without continuing the Austrian model. And concerning this, your Professor Tibi's question, the project you talk about integration. It's of course a very modern and post-World War project. It's not in this time, because I think the project of integration and preserving the kind of ethnic Jewish life was not accepted by the surrounding. It's not accepted maybe also due to the French model, which excluded this kind of particularism and differences. And the second explanation is, I think, you must remember that between the wars, we are in the period when the democracy is out of fashion, and the model you discussed needs absolutely democracy. Now it's possible, but now even the Jews are disappearing, and it's very easy to give all the rights to a very small community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robert, would you say, for the sake of symmetry? Okay. Thank you very much to all our speakers, to you, and the well-merited coffee is served on the 4th floor downstairs, and you are allowed to take 15 minutes? 15 minutes. Thank you very much.